Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that, well, it's probably haunted human thought forever. What happens after we die?
It's a huge one, right? A
Yeah.
truly universal enigma.
Absolutely. And our mission in this deep dive is to explore the surprisingly diverse forms of evidence people point to, things suggesting there might be something more after this.
And we're going to look at it from all sorts of angles: religion, philosophy.
Parapsychology, even neuroscience. We're trying to give you, our listener, a kind of shortcut to understanding this really complex topic without getting bogged down in just one perspective.
Yeah, and a key thing right at the start, the idea of evidence itself totally shifts depending on where you look.
How so?
Well, what counts as proof? In religion, scripture might be the foundation. For a scientist, it's all about empirical data. They're just different standards.
That's a really important point. Recognizing that difference is crucial as we go through this.
Definitely.
And this isn't just a modern thing, is it? Beliefs about an afterlife, they go way back.
Oh, absolutely. Think ancient burial rituals equipping the dead for a journey. Major religions have elaborate doctrines.
And then there are those really personal stories, like near-death experiences. It shows how deeply rooted this idea is. It taps into our fears, our search for meaning, maybe even justice.
Exactly. So we'll unpack all that. And just to be clear, we're aiming to explore the ideas in our sources impartially, without pushing any specific belief.
Right. Okay, so where should we begin?
Let's start with the cultural and religious perspectives. How different traditions tackle this question. They offer explanations, sure, but also comfort and moral guidance.
Okay. So one big idea that comes up a lot is reincarnation, this cycle of life, death, rebirth.
Right. Central to Hinduism and Buddhism. And it's tied to karma, not just like cosmic plus and minus points.
Or like consequences.
Yeah, more like how the intentions behind your actions subtly shape what comes next. It's this continuous loop. Puts a lot of emphasis on personal responsibility.
Yeah. And it's not only an Eastern concept, right? I remember reading about ancient Greeks.
Yeah, Pythagoras, Plato, they talked about similar ideas. And you find it in some tribal societies, too. It pops up in different places.
Interesting. So what's the alternative view?
Well, you have the more linear model, common in the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
That's the single life, then judgment, heaven or hell kind of picture.
Essentially, yes. A single earthly life, followed by resurrection, and then a final judgment that determines your eternal fate. The key concept there is the immortal soul, the part of you that endures.
That linear model with a final judgment, it definitely carries a lot of moral weight, doesn't it? It really emphasizes the consequence of actions in this life.
It does. And beyond those main frameworks, there's a whole spectrum of other ideas.
Like purgatory.
Purgatory in Catholicism, yeah. Valhalla for Norse warriors, Jannah Paradise in Islam, Sheol in early Hebrew thought.
Yeah.
Kind of a shadowy underworld.
And ancestor spirits, too, in some cultures, believing they still interact with the living.
Exactly. It just shows the incredible diversity. Conceptions range from, a smooth transition to another state, all the way to death being the absolute end.
So for many people, these beliefs aren't about digging through evidence in a lab.
Not at all. For a huge number of people, it stems directly from faith, from sacred texts, tradition. Think of the Buddha recalling his past lives that's foundational in Buddhism, accepted through that lens.
And when you compare these different views, what actually survives death changes dramatically.
Totally. In Hinduism, you have the Atman, this eternal self trying to merge back with the universal Brahman.
Which is very different from the Buddhist idea of Atman, no self.
Right. And Atman is more about the continuity of consciousness and karmic patterns, not a fixed, unchanging soul. And then Christianity has the individual immortal soul. So the very definition of the surviving entity shapes the whole picture.
Yeah, that makes sense. What kind of evidence would you even look for if you don't believe in a persistent self? It changes the whole game.
Precisely. But one theme that keeps coming back across most traditions.
Let me guess what you do in this life matters.
Exactly. Earthly actions influence your afterlife status. Whether it's karma or divine judgment, there's that link. It suggests these beliefs aren't just about explaining death. They also help reinforce ethical behavior, social cohesion.
It really highlights the power of these narratives, the human imagination grappling with mortality. And despite the huge differences, you see these recurring themes: persistence, the significance of our actions, hope.
It shows how fundamental these questions are. And just to map some of this out, we've got a table comparing afterlife beliefs in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. looking at their ideas about the soul, the afterlife, judgment, karma, destiny, and earthly conduct.
Okay, so that's the landscape of belief. Now let's switch gears to philosophy. How do philosophers tackle the possibility of survival using logic and analyzing consciousness itself?
Right. Philosophy dives deep into the mind-body problem.
Right.
Basically, how does our mental stuff, thoughts, feelings, awareness, relate to our physical stuff, our brain and body?
The classic question, are mind and brain the same thing or different?
Broadly, you have two camps: dualism and materialism. Dualism says mind and body are fundamentally different.
Like Descartes. Mind is thinking stuff, body is physical stuff.
That's substance dualism, yes. Two separate substances. If that's true, maybe the mind could exist independently. It opens that door, conceptually.
Are there other kinds of dualism?
There's also property dualism. This view says there's only physical stuff, but it can have both physical and mental properties, like consciousness. Consciousness emerges from the brain, but isn't just brain activity. Still leaves room for non-physical aspects.
Okay, and the opposing view, materialism.
Materialism, or physicalism, argues that everything mental is ultimately physical. It's brain activity. Consciousness is what the brain does.
So if materialism is right, when the brain dies,
Consciousness ceases,
Yeah.
game over. It's all tied to the physical hardware.
you can see how your starting point here, dualist or materialist, really shapes everything else. It affects how you'd even interpret something like a near-death experience.
Absolutely. A materialist looks for a brain explanation. A dualist might see evidence for the mind separating from the body.
So what are some of the actual philosophical arguments for survival? They often come from that dualist perspective, right?
Often, yes. Or at least from views where consciousness isn't just brain stuff. Plato offered some early ones.
Like his theory of forms, the idea that our soul gets glimpses of this perfect eternal realm.
Exactly. His affinity argument says the soul apprehends these eternal forms, so it must share their nature, be eternal too. Then there's reminiscence. Learning is just remembering past knowledge, implying the soul existed before birth.
And the cycles argument, life from death, death from life.
Right, suggesting a continuous process. Then you jump forward to Descartes.
The I think, therefore I am guy.
That's him. He argued for mind-body distinction. His conceivability argument.
Yeah.
We can imagine mind without body, so they must be distinct. The indivisibility argument. Mind seems indivisible. Body is divisible, so different substances. And the doubt argument. You can doubt your body exists, but not that your mind does, because doubting is thinking. Different levels of certainty imply different natures.
And more recent arguments focus on consciousness itself.
Yeah, the nature of subjective experience qualia, the what it's like feeling, how does that arise from physical stuff? And intentionality thoughts are about things. Plus, Chalmers' hard problem, why physical processes create subjective experience at all, these all hint consciousness might be more than just physical.
But these arguments aren't universally accepted, I take it.
Not at all. They rely on premises like Plato's forms, or whether the mind is truly indivisible, that are highly debated. They're more about exploring logical possibilities than providing empirical proof.
Okay, so what about the arguments against survival, rooted more in materialism?
Definitely. The biggest one is simply the overwhelming evidence that consciousness depends on the brain.
Brain damage, drugs, illness, they all affect the mind.
Precisely. It strongly suggests mind and brain are tightly linked, if not identical. Materialists tend to see the explanatory gap, why consciousness feels the way it does, as a temporary problem for science, not proof of something non-physical. They're optimistic we'll figure it out.
Makes sense. What else challenges survival?
The problem of personal identity. If you are your memories, your personality, tied to your brain and body, what happens when they're gone?
Because you even make sense anymore.
That's the question. Reincarnation faces this if you don't remember past lives. Are you really the same person? Even for dualists, if the soul survives but loses all its memories and traits, is that really your survival?
It's a tough one. What constitutes me?
Materialism has a simple, if stark, answer. Identity ends when the brain dies.
And then there's just the straightforward nihilistic view. Death is the end. Full stop.
Yeah, consciousness is brain activity, brain stops, consciousness stops. Like flipping a switch. It's a view many find unsettling, obviously.
Understandable.
And finally, Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony. Materialism is simpler. Why posit non-physical souls if physical explanations might suffice? Don't multiply entities unnecessarily.
So philosophy gives us this intense debate, really getting down to the core concepts. We've got another table summarizing these key arguments for and against survival, which might help keep track.
Okay, Moving from abstract arguments to, well, actual experiences people report near death, let's talk about near-death experiences, or NDEs.
Right, NDEs. These have become much more talked about as resuscitation techniques improve. More people are coming back from the brink and sharing these incredible stories.
They are profound psychological events, and they often share striking similarities.
So what are the common features people report?
Often there's this intense feeling of peace, no pain. The out-of-body experience, the OBE, is very common. Feeling like you're floating, watching things unfold below, maybe seeing your own body.
The tunnel and the light.
That's classic imagery, yes. Moving through darkness towards a brilliant light. Also, a life review, seeing your life flash by, often focusing on emotions and impact on others.
Encounters with beings, loved ones who've passed.
Frequently reported, sometimes described as spiritual beings, too.
Mm.
Also, time and space feel different. Senses might feel heightened, and often a sense of reaching a boundary, a point of no return, maybe having to choose or being told to go back.
Are they always positive experiences?
Mostly, but not always. Some people report distressing or frightening NDEs. That's important to remember, too.
And these experiences seem to have lasting effects on people.
Huge effects. A big one is a reduced fear of death. Sometimes it disappears completely.
That fundamental fear just gone.
Often, yes. Also, increased spirituality, maybe not formal religion, but a sense of connection. More appreciation for life, more altruism, feeling a stronger sense of purpose. Material things seem less important.
Personality changes too.
Yeah, people often describe becoming more loving, empathetic, accepting, and these after effects happen whether you think the NDE was real or brain-based. The impact is undeniable. It suggests NDEs are important to study, maybe for therapy, grief counseling, end-of-life care, even if we don't have the final answer on survival.
So, scientifically, how do researchers try to explain NDEs? What's the brain-based perspective?
Neuroscience usually points to physiological mechanisms in the stressed or dying brain. Things like lack of oxygen anoxia or too much carbon dioxide hypercarbia.
Endorphins, drug effects.
Endorphin release, effects of anesthetics like ketamine, maybe abnormal electrical activity like temporal lobe seizures, specific brain networks kicking in under extreme stress, that sort of thing.
I heard about a newer model trying to pull these threads together.
Yes. There was a 2025 Nature Reviews Neurology article proposing a more integrated model. It suggests NDEs involve a whole cascade of processes, changes in brain cells, network activity, neurotransmitters, all happening within an evolutionary context, like the brain's ultimate coping mechanism for a life-threatening event. It draws on animal studies, psychedelic research, studies of dying brains.
So it's not just the brain shutting down then? I kind of pictured it just fading out.
It seems more complex. Some recent studies actually challenge that idea of total hypoactivity during, say, cardiac arrest. They've observed bursts of high-frequency brain activity.
Activity that might correlate with conscious experience.
Potentially, yes. So the debate is shifting. It's not just if the brain is active, but what kind of activity is happening, and can it really account for the clarity and richness of NDEs, especially the ones with, well, the really tricky bits.
The veridical perceptions. The OBEs where people report seeing things they shouldn't have been able to see. That's where it gets wild, right?
This is a major challenge for purely physiological explanations, yeah. Veridical OBEs, where someone accurately perceives events around their unconscious body, maybe during surgery or cardiac arrest.
Are there studies on this?
There are. Sabot and Sartori found NDEers could often describe resuscitation details accurately, more so than control groups who guessed. Janice Holden reviewed cases and found high accuracy in OBE reports. NDERF research also indicates most OBE descriptions are realistic. Investigators found no inaccuracies.
It's hard to explain if the brain is supposed to be offline or severely impaired.
Exactly. How do you get lucid, organized consciousness, sometimes even heightened consciousness, as reported in NDRF surveys during something like cardiac arrest when cortical activity usually stops within seconds?
And there are even more challenging cases.
Yes. Reports from people blind from birth who describe visual perceptions during an NDE, or NDEs occurring under general anesthesia when awareness should be completely suppressed. These veridical OBEs, especially under conditions of minimal brain function, really push the boundaries. They suggest mind and brain might dissociate, which would force a rethink of neuroscience's models of consciousness. It could potentially support non-physicalist views.
But skeptics must have alternative explanations for these claims.
Oh, absolutely. They suggest NDEs could be hallucinations or dreams caused by brain stress. For the veridical bits, they propose coincidence, Selective memory, remembering only the hits or confabulation, filling in gaps later.
Or maybe unconsciously hearing things.
Right, overhearing details and incorporating them into the memory. Plus, it's hard to perfectly reconstruct all the physiological factors after the fact, and cultural background definitely shapes interpretation. But there are organizations like NDEs, journals like the Journal of Near-Death Studies, and researchers like Van Lommel, Grayson, Long, Ring, who are dedicated to studying this rigorously.
So NDEs are this complex mix, consistent features, profound effects, challenging anomalies like veridical OBEs, and ongoing scientific debate. We've got a table summarizing the features, experiences, explanations, and challenges.
Okay, let's shift again to another line of research. Claims of reincarnation, specifically focusing on children reporting past life memories.
This is the work pioneered by Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, right? Fascinating stuff. Little kids just starting to talk, coming out with these detailed stories.
Exactly. Stevenson and his successors at DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies, have documented thousands of cases. Usually kids aged 2 to 7 spontaneously start talking about a previous life, names, places, family, how they died.
Are there common patterns in these stories?
There seem to be. Often the previous life ended prematurely, usually violently. The child might show strong emotions about the past family, unusual behaviors, or phobias linked to the death, like fear of water if the person drowned. These phobias often fade as the child gets older and stops talking about it.
And the researchers try to verify these claims. It's not just anecdote collection.
No, the methodology is key. Crucially, they document the child's statements in detail before trying to find the person the child claims to have been. That's vital to minimize contamination.
So they record everything first, then investigate.
Yes. Then they search records, interview people, trying to identify a deceased individual who matches the details. If they find a potential match, they interview that person's surviving relatives and friends to see if the child's specific statements check out.
And what about the birthmarks? That seems particularly strange.
That's one of the most compelling and puzzling aspects. Some children have birthmarks or birth defects that correspond spatially to wounds, often fatal wounds, on the body of the claimed previous personality.
Wow, how do they verify that?
They gather evidence, medical records, autopsy reports, photos, eyewitness testimony to document the wounds on the deceased person and compare the location and appearance to the child's birthmark or defect. This physical correlation is really hard to explain conventionally. Psychology or cultural factors don't easily account for a physical mark matching someone else's injuries.
It implies something very strange, either unknown biology or extreme psychosomatics across lives.
Or something else entirely. It's a major anomaly. They also document unusual behaviors, skills, phobias in the child that match the deceased personality but aren't explained by the child's current life. Sometimes they use recognition tests with photos. DOPS has over 2,200 cases, and at about 70% they feel they've identified the previous personality.
But there must be skepticism about this too. What are the counter-explanations?
Plenty of skepticism. Cryptomnesia is one hidden memory. Maybe the child overheard things unconsciously. Researchers counter this by highlighting cases where the previous person was obscure or lived far away.
What about parents influencing the child? Or fraud?
Parental suggestion or coaching is a concern. But the very young age, the complexity of details, sometimes details the parents couldn't have known. It argues against that in many cases. Fraud is always possible, but seems unlikely to explain the sheer volume and consistency.
Cultural factors. Many cases come from places where reincarnation is a common belief.
True, cultural reinforcement likely plays a role in reporting. But cases also occur in the West, and core features young age, violent death specifics seem consistent across cultures, suggesting it's not just culture.
Simple fantasy. Kids have vivid imaginations.
Possible, but the level of specific verifiable detail often goes beyond typical fantasy. Then there are methodological critiques, potential bias, interpreter issues, delays, and the big one. There's no known scientific mechanism for transferring memories, let alone birthmark predispositions.
So the debate is really about the strength of the methodology and whether these solved cases, especially the birthmark ones, are genuine anomalies.
Exactly. Are the safeguards enough? Are these cases truly unexplained by current science?
Okay. Now let's touch on a couple of other areas, mediumship and past life regression. These seem to attract even more scientific skepticism. Why is that?
It largely comes down to a really long history of fraud, plus significant methodological and ethical problems. Let's take mediumship, first claimed communication with spirits.
Different types, right? Mental, physical.
Yeah, mental mediumship involves things like telepathy, clairvoyance, seeing or hearing spirits. Physical mediumship claims tangible effects, raps, moving objects, even materializations.
This was huge in the 19th century, wasn't it? The spiritualist movement, even scientists got involved.
Hugely popular. Figures like William James Crookes investigated. Organizations like the Society for Psychical Research were formed. But the history is absolutely rife with fraud.
Trickery.
Massive amounts of it, especially with physical mediumship. Cheesecloth for ectoplasm, hidden contraptions. Famous mediums like the Fox sisters, Dee Home, Palladino many were exposed. Houdini made a second career out of debunking them.
So the scientific consensus today is pretty negative.
Overwhelmingly skeptical. The lack of replicable proof under controlled conditions, plus that history of fraud, means it's generally not considered reliable evidence for survival. Mental mediums are often suspected of using cold reading or hot reading techniques to gather information subtly. Research attempts like the Veritas program have been heavily criticized methodologically.
Okay. And past life regression therapy, similar issues.
Similar skepticism, but with added ethical concerns. This uses hypnosis to supposedly access past life memories for therapeutic benefit.
Proponents like Brian Weiss claim it helps people.
They do, but mainstream psychiatry doesn't support it. Firstly, it relies on reincarnation, which lacks scientific proof. But the main issue is the high risk of implanting false memories.
Because hypnosis makes you suggestible.
Exactly. A therapist, even meaning well, can easily guide a suggestible client to create vivid, detailed, but entirely false memories. This can be really harmful if people start blaming current problems on fabricated past lives. Remember the satanic ritual abuse panic. False memories created in therapy. It's a serious danger.
So, ethically dubious because it might actually harm the patient.
That's the core ethical objection, potentially violated the do no harm principle.
Right.
It's very different from the spontaneous memories reported by children in Stevenson's research. The persistent interest in these things shows a deep human need for answers and connection, but the lack of evidence and ethical risks demand critical evaluation.
Right. So we've looked at religion, philosophy, NDEs, reincarnation claims, mediumship. A huge range. How do we even begin to put all this together?
It's tough. The different types of claims, the different standards of evidence, drawing a single conclusion is incredibly challenging, and our own beliefs inevitably filter how we see it all.
So if we try to weigh the different kinds of evidence, what are the main takeaways for each? Strengths and weaknesses.
Okay. Religious cultural beliefs.
Yeah.
Strength is providing meaning, morals, comfort. Limitation. Faith-based, not empirically testable. Philosophical arguments. Strength is clarifying concepts, logic. Limitation. No empirical proof, depend on debatable premises.
NDEs.
NDEs. Strengths are consistency. Transformative effects. The challenge of veridical OBEs. Limitations. Subjective, hard to control. Many features do have potential physical psychological explanations. Verified veridical perceptions are rare.
Reincarnation research.
Children's spontaneous memories. Strengths are specific verifiable details, especially the birthmark cases. Limitations. Cultural factors, potential data contamination, methodological criticisms still exist.
And mediumship PLR.
Generally weak evidence. Mediumship plagued by fraud. Past life regression has major ethical issues and false memory risks.
It feels like with NDEs and reincarnation, there's this signal versus noise problem you mentioned.
Exactly. Lots of anecdotes. But within that, a smaller set of really anomalous cases, the veridical OBEs, the birthmark correspondences that are harder to dismiss. The debate is whether that signal is real, pointing to something beyond current science, or if it's just noise we haven't fully explained yet.
And how does this scientific investigation mesh with philosophy and personal experience? There seems to be a tension there.
There absolutely is. Science wants objective, repeatable data. Personal experience is subjective, unique. Skepticism is crucial. It pushes for rigor, demands better evidence. Materialism is the dominant scientific view, but these anomalies, if real, challenge it.
But research continues in places like DOPS, INDs.
Yes, they keep investigating despite mainstream skepticism. Trying to study potentially spiritual phenomena scientifically is hard, partly because it might not fit current paradigms. There's a history of psychical research being pushed out of mainstream science. Now, you see some speculative ideas, quantum consciousness, simulation theory trying to bridge the gap, but they're still very speculative.
So reflecting on this whole deep dive, where does that leave us?
It leaves us with a mystery, honestly. Life after death remains profoundly unresolved. How you interpret the data we've discussed depends so much on your starting point, your worldview, what you accept as knowledge.
We tried to give a balanced overview of the different claims and critiques.
Right. highlighting the genuinely intriguing stuff like vertical OBEs and birthmark cases, but also the critical perspectives and the methodological hurdles. The quest continues, driven by curiosity, hope, fear of death, the need for meaning.
Definitive answers seem out of reach, for now at least.
Seems that way. But continued exploration, better science, clearer philosophy, respectful listening to experiences might bring more understanding about consciousness, about the limits of what we know, maybe even about the human spirit. Future neuroscience, better parapsychology methods, maybe new physics? Who knows?
So the question remains open. Requires some humility, maybe.
Humility and continued inquiry, definitely.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. We've journeyed through religion, philosophy, science, looking at this ancient question of life after death.
It's clearly complex, no easy answers.
But hopefully you, our listener, now have a better grasp of the different viewpoints, the different kinds of evidence, and just how nuanced this whole discussion is.
As you think about all this, maybe consider how your own background, your own experiences, shape how you see this enduring enigma. What parts of this resonate most with you, and why?
Food for thought. We encourage you to keep exploring. Until next time, keep diving deep.